Welcome to our introduction to A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. A Tale of Two Cities is one of Dickens' best ever written novels. It starts in 1775. Right before writing this novel, Dickens had read a cart full of books to become better aware of the incidents that led to the French Revolution that took part in France and Paris. Tale of Two Cities is a comparison between both the two great cities of London and Paris and how things were different in each of the two big cities and how it was eminent for the people in France to have a revolution and not for the people in England. He had all through the book linked the two cities together, both by Tellson's Bank, that was actually an English bank that had a French branch in Paris, and some of the characters, Mr. Lorry, the banker, who worked in the bank and at the same time lived at some time and was a close friend of Dr. Manette, and Dr. Manette himself, who was French, but after being imprisoned for quite a long time, he goes back and revived by his daughter that was brought up and raised in England. The novel opens in 1775. In the introduction, which is one of the best written introductions ever by Dickens, he portrays how corruption reigns in both England and France. Mr. Jarvis Lorry and Lucy Manette were asked to go back to France, to Saint Antoine, because there were news that Dr. Manette, who was considered dead for the last 18 years, was discovered to be alive and imprisoned in a prison in France, and he was found and staying at his ex-servant, Monsieur Devarge, and as he was a prisoner in the Bastille for the past 18 years without being accused, without being declared that he's being held there, and both Mr. Manette, Mr. Lorry, and Lucy went back to Saint Antoine to get Dr. Manette back, as he was staying at his former servant, Monsieur Devarge. When Lucy and Mr. Lorry go back to Saint Antoine, they actually discovered that Dr. Manette was not the real, or the one that used to be that respectable, honorable doctor, but he was a shadow of himself. He was completely lost. He only knew himself as 105 North Tower, which was the number of his cell during his imprisonment, and he couldn't really recognize anybody, neither Monsieur Devarge nor Mr. Lorry. The only one that he could recognize was his daughter, because she looked very much like her mother, and he took to her the moment he saw her. 5 years later, after getting Dr. Manette back to England and reviving him with her love and compassion, Lucy have regained him, and we see them again in the trial of Charles Darnay, a man that they met on their way out of France, and he was accused of treason and he was about to be sentenced to death. He is acquitted, largely because Sidney Carton, the main and the lead character in our novel, helped him to really escape the death penalty from treason because of his sharp intelligence and his great help. And of course, what helped him the most was the great resemblance between the two of them. They looked very much alike in appearance, but very much different in character. And that's what would lead Sidney Carton to really envy and hate Charles Darnay, because he couldn't really be like him, even though he looked very much like him. Sidney Carton confesses his love to Lucy and promises to make any sacrifice for her, for any person who's dear to her, and he's going to be held to this promise, and he will help her save her husband at the end of the story. Charles Darnay's ruthless aristocratic uncle, the Marquis de Vermont, while ordering the driver of his carriage to drive at full speed in the busy streets of Saint Antoine in Paris, he kills the son or the child of Gaspard, a peasant in Saint Antoine, and the next morning the Marquis is found murdered in his bed. Of course, by the father of the poor child that was killed for no good accusation or anything. After a year of the death of the Marquis and Gaspard's child, Gaspard himself, who had murdered the Marquis, has been found and executed, killed, and even petitions to get him cleared of this crime, because he was under so much pressure seeing his son killed under the carriage of the Marquis, but it didn't really help. Madame Duvarge, after learning about the Evermont's castle and how Gaspard was killed for killing the Marquis de Vermont, she registered into her knitting the name of Evermont, which is the new husband of Lucy Manette, who is Charles Darnay, and he is this way doomed the destruction, to be killed when the French Revolution actually starts. When she learns that Charles Darnay is the nephew of the late Marquis, she registers the name of Charles Darnay in that list of destruction. On July 14th, that's the National Day of France up to today, 1789, the peasants, the poor, the miserables of Saint Antoine and all the neighboring areas of Paris, they storm out the Bastille. The Bastille is the symbol of oppression, where the nobles actually kept people in prison for no accusation, just because they issued a warrant of arrest to have them put there. Charles Darnay decides to return to France, unfortunately, in order to save a family servant, Monsieur Gabelle, who had been acting on his behalf since he is now the new Marquis de Vermont. But Gabelle was about to lose his life, and Charles Darnay would lose his name and his honor if this Monsieur Gabelle is killed because of carrying out his own orders in the estate that he had there. In France, Darnay is imprisoned as an immigrant. There have been new laws because of the revolution. People who took their money and fled out of France, they were called immigrants. So he was accused as an immigrant, someone who escaped out of France with his money and so on. And after 1 year of being imprisoned as an immigrant, he's acquitted. He's found not guilty, thanks to Dr. Manette, who really worked hard to get his son-in-law out of this imprisonment. But on the same day, he is imprisoned again, denounced by the Devarges, Monsieur and Madame Devarge, and one other person. And to our astonishment, that one other person is no one but Dr. Manette, the man who saved his life that very morning. At this second trial, a document written by Dr. Manette in 1767, while he was a prisoner at the Bastille and before losing his mind, when he was a prisoner there, he had written it with his blood and the burning part of bread, and he had written the story how he was imprisoned in the Bastille, okay, by the Marquis de Vermont, and how he and his brother were responsible for the death of the whole family of Madame Devarge. Her father, who died broken-hearted after his daughter was abused by the two brothers, and after having killed her own husband by overworking him and so on. And her brother, who defended her honor, who was stabbed and killed by the two evil brothers de Vermont. Charles is instantly sentenced to death right after the letter that Dr. Manette had written in his imprisonment was read to the people of San Antone and to the tribunal of the committee that tried him in court. Sidney Carton, right afterwards, let's remember that he had promised his love of his life, Lucy Manette, that he would save her life or a life close to her or near to her. Sidney Carton manages to get into Charles Darnay's cell. He knows that Charles Darnay would never accept to be let out without really being killed for what his father and uncle had done. He drugs Charles Darnay and goes to the guillotine in his place, while he had arranged for Dr. Manette, Lucy, and little Lucy, and Mr. Lorry to get out of France right before he is executed by the guillotine. His last words are, "It's a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done, and it's a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known," is one of the most famous quotations in English literature. And this is one of the best written novels, and I think you will definitely enjoy reading and living the events of this novel. Now we'll have just a brief analysis of the main characters in the novel. The one that I liked the most of these characters was actually portrayed in such a beautiful way by Dickens that you can neither hate and cannot help but love this Sidney Carton character. Even though we hear that he has so many negative things and so on, we cannot help but falling in love with him, even though he does everything that's good for other people but not really good for himself. No person in Dickens' gallery occupies a higher place than does Sidney Carton. Dickens rouses in the reader the same admiration he himself feels for this character, since it represents actually one of his real friends who had these very same traits and character. And that's why he was really impressed by the character and wanted to be represented in this story. From the beginning, Dickens impresses on the reader that Sidney Carton is, in essence, not what he seems to be. The reader recognizes the brilliant mind. He is first pictured as lazy and indifferent at Darnay's trial, but he is quick to observe and act when he sees a way to save Darnay's life. Even though he pretends not to notice anything happening around him, he was in full control and getting everything under his own recognition and observation. He's a lonely man. I care for no man on earth, and no man on earth cares for me. That's what he says. But what he really does is completely opposite to this. He says soon after saving a man's life, he is an excessive drinker. That's what we hear. We're told that by Dickens himself, but we never see him actually completely drunk or misbehaving because of his drunkenness. Even when he leaves Stryver's room where he exercises his powers of analysis in the preparation of Stryver's cases, that Stryver actually acts like the lion who takes all credit for the work that Sidney Carton does, for the presentation in court the following day. After one such night, Dickens lets the reader glimpse into the mind and soul of Sidney. Sidney reveals a precise knowledge of himself and a sensitivity to the values that give life meaning, love, friendship, beauty, and faith. He is unable to realize them in his own life. On the same night, Dickens gives the reader insight into Carton's youth, and he and Stryver talk about their school days when Sidney did the lessons of the other boys but not his own lessons. He would do the homework for his fellow friends at school but not doing his own. So he doesn't graduate and he doesn't really get the degree while all the others do. He helped everybody except himself. Was he, even as a child, isolated by his own genius but seeking companionship? Dr. Manette, the father of Lucy and the ex-Bastille prisoner, the man who gained so much by being a prisoner, by gaining power over the people of France because of his suffering, in the earlier thinking of what to call the story, Dickens was about actually to call it, the Doctor of Beauvais, long ago, and Buried Alive, since he was the central character, the one that all the action revolves around, but at the same time, we cannot really consider him the main lead of the story, since Sidney Carton is the one actually leading all the action and taking control over everything, in the events of the story till the very end, even after he dies. By virtue of circumstances rather than by nature, he is a lonely man now that his wife is dead and he's all by himself. Through the written account of his misfortunes, Dr. Manette, a reader knows that he was rising in his profession and was happily married when he was seized or caught for having revealed the wrongs and the crimes that were committed by a pair of nobles, the two brothers de Vermont, and was imprisoned by a lettre de cachet that they have issued from the minister, and they had left him in prison for 18 years for no crime that he committed, just for trying to reveal or report their multiple crimes that they had for the family of Madame Devarge in front of the minister. That he reported the wrongs of these two nobles is evidence of his integrity, how honorable he was, and his courage as well. Seemingly, the physical and emotional injuries of the imprisonment are removed by the loving care of Lucy. Lucy had a rare job of saving her father and really reclaiming him back to life and making him as one whole person again. However, like Dickens himself, who always bore deep within him the psychological hurts of his childhood, and since it affected his character, and he wrote in many of his novels about his boor and his suffering in his childhood, Dr. Manette cannot always put down his psychological wounds or control his emotional responses when certain circumstances take place, especially reminding him of his suffering, of his losing his wife, and so on. After his falling back, occasioned by Lucy's marriage to an Evermond, the family that really hurt him the most, but he knew that guy that was about to marry his own daughter had nothing to do with whatever his father and uncle had done to him. So he had to allow the marriage, but at the same time, he couldn't really stop himself from being sad of by marrying his only daughter to the only child of the people who hurt him the most in his life. Mr. Lorry advises the patient, Dr. Manette, to reduce his activities. The doctor strongly advises against reduction of activity. He recommends that the patient himself pursue his studies, his experiments, and other healthful activities as a way to make up for the strains of his life and the repulses that he used to get into whenever something affected his life. Lucy Manette, and she's the daughter, the loving wife for Charles Downey, and the compassionate woman who understood Sidney Carton's loneliness and felt sorry for him. That's a third character that we have to analyze. At all times, she reveals only those qualities that are universally admired and respected, being loving, beloved daughter, wife, mother, and friend. She's too good to be true, as some people might call it. In a tight-lipped attempt to conceal his feelings from Mr. Stryver, Sidney Carton calls her a golden-haired doll. Indeed, her physical features are perfect in themselves, but Lucy's beauty goes far deeper than the mere physical appearance of her. Her warmth and compassion restore life to Dr. Manette. They inspire Sidney Carton to commit the greatest act of his life by giving his life away and saving her husband and her father and her family. They give meaning to Miss Prost's life, her love and compassion, her beauty, and they make Lucy an ideal wife and mother. Although she tends to faint in difficult situations, she had got enough strength to stand outside La Force prison 2 hours every afternoon for a year and 3 months, and she manages a courageous farewell when Charles is sentenced to death. I think that will be a brief introduction to main events of our novel for this year, and we will really have so much fun studying it together, looking into what's between the lines, understanding the events together, and really enjoying reading one of the greatest novels ever written by Charles Dickens. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this introduction, and await for your discussion when we have it in class next week. Thank you very much, and goodbye.